Do you think, does this come as a surprise to you, what just happened with the invasion? Or were you surprised as well, knowing all the things you know about Russia and having studied it, having been there?
No, I was not surprised.
Everybody is worried about, a hot war, as they say, or nuclear weapons. I mean, do you see that as a possibility? Thank you. Dr. Kennedy, thank you so much for, first of all, giving us your time. And I'm really, really grateful to you. Of course, I haven't seen you in a while, so hello to you. How are things in Atlanta?
Everything's fine here, Cheyenne. It's a great pleasure to see you again. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been, definitely. Dr. Kennedy, unfortunately, we meet at a time where tensions are high. Everybody's sort of worried about what's going to happen. And, before we jump into the questions, I just wanted to, I have a long list of your credentials here with me. I can read from it, and I will definitely put it up with the show. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit about just how you introduce yourself. I know you're a professor emeritus still at Georgia Tech, but I know you have a huge background in government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's a pretty long time in government. It started off mostly with flying airplanes for Uncle Sam's Air Force, and then working at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. At that particular time, I did quite a bit of work looking at U.S.-Soviet competition, strategic competition, and the mutual and balanced force reductions in Europe, and U.S. and NATO Warsaw Pact interaction. So I was kind of the guy in the military affairs division that held the strategic arms limitation talks portfolio, the MBFR talks, and the Conference on Security and Cooperation. So that sort of got me started in all of this. And after that, I went up and did much of the same kind of thing for the Army's Strategic Studies Institute. So I've been traveling back and forth to Russia since 1977. As a matter of fact, I've probably covered more of Russia than most, many Russians. We've been from, mostly on business, but also on pleasure. We've traveled from St. Petersburg all the way to Vladivostok and up near the Arctic Circle, and we've traveled quite a bit around Russia. So, I've also had the opportunity to serve as the deputy commandant of the NATO Defense College, where we kind of looked at that particular time at dealing with the Soviet Union, and then later as director of the Marshall Center in Europe, where we actually brought quite a few Russians. As a matter of fact, the largest contingent of people that came to the Marshall Center from the varying countries. We had some 40 plus countries coming to the Marshall Center, looking at European security issues and security issues around the globe. And the largest contingent of those people were from Russia. I went back and forth with the Russians, oftentimes chatting with varying levels of people from the Russian Republic.
So it'll be fair to say, first of all, also, I saw that you also had the local international affairs group in Atlanta. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, about around 2014, I was invited to become the president of the Atlantic Council on International Relations, and we bring people from all over the country, and we've done some Zooms with people around the globe who will speak to us about their concerns, the issues that they confront in the international environment. And so we've had some very interesting and notable people.
Out of curiosity, has anyone, because the Ukraine issue with Russia has been pretty hot in the last few years, since at least 2014, has anyone from Ukraine or Russia come to speak on this topic in your group, or no?
No, we thought President Zelensky was going to do that. We had a pretty close link to him about 2 years ago. But ultimately we couldn't make it happen. We were hoping that would be the case. So what we've had are mostly people from not from Ukraine speaking about those kind of issues.
Okay. So, Dr. Kennedy, you mentioned two things, which obviously, everybody knows pretty much what NATO is. They've heard about it, obviously, but you obviously were part of NATO. Do you think, does this come as a surprise to you, what just happened with the invasion? Or were you surprised as well, knowing all the things you know about Russia and having studied it, having been there?
No, I was not surprised. And I did a commentary here. I felt that Putin was not adequately dissuaded from invading. He had positioned too many forces to make it look like a simple exercise. Everybody thought he was simply trying to bring pressure on Ukraine, including the Ukrainians and many Russians. I disagree with that. I thought that he would not be deterred by sanctions, that his ambitions were greater, and that we needed to, I thought one of the largest strategic mistakes we made was taking the threat of the use of military force off the table very early in these negotiations. You just don't do that in a crisis management negotiation. And I had been warned many years ago by President Alexander Kwasniewski from Poland when I hosted him for dinner in Germany about Putin. The Poles have always been concerned about Russians. As a matter of fact, if you look back in their history, when you could almost argue that the first person that the Poles hated during World War II was the Germans. The second person they hated were the Russians. They were the ones that sat on the other side of the Vistula when Poland was being destroyed by the Germans, and they're the ones that really forced an occupation on Poland, and they finally are recovering from that. So he had warned me about the dangers of Putin. And so I was not surprised at all.
Were you surprised at the fact that even, or maybe at least the news that we were getting just before, days before the invasion, was that even in Ukraine on the ground, people weren't that certain that this was going to happen. Was that your information as well, or do you think that was just sort of being played out in the media, but people were preparing?
Well, it's really hard to say. Don't forget, President Zelensky himself was playing it down. I can see for a variety of reasons. You can play down the fact that you're likely to be invaded, hoping that maybe Putin will at last minute decide not to, and he might well have decided not to. And of course, you don't want to play up the fact that you're going to be invaded and cause mass migrations, a disintegration of your economy, which is exactly what Putin would have loved to have seen, and the threats to your own presidency. So he did, in fact, play that down. He kept his economy alive. He's kept his people going, and he's turned out to be quite a democratic leader.
And do you think that you mentioned that we should not have taken military action off the table quickly? You're basically pointing out to when President Biden pretty much said that we will not engage directly on the offset of this situation. I don't know his exact terms, but now it seems like he's taking a U-turn, or at least it seems like yesterday a lot of people are saying that he's escalating quite a bit by saying that he wants regime change in Russia.
Well, let me say, first of all, I don't think that kind of comment or derogatory comments about a national leader that you have to deal with in the international arena is very good diplomacy. Despite all of the millions of people that Stalin was killing, remember, we still had to deal with Joseph Stalin during World War II. And so it's seldom that national leaders will take that kind of step and call for regime change, especially when you're talking about a major leader that you have to deal with in a major crisis. So I think that's an error that's being committed in Washington. And I regret that, because I think that other than those kind of errors and the failure to keep the military option on the table, the administration has done reasonably well. As a matter of fact, one could say extraordinarily well in keeping the allies together and putting pressure on Putin. That does not mean that Putin will give up his objectives.
Right. It seems like a lot of people, and perhaps rightfully so, react very viscerally to Putin. Like, people really hate him a lot, or there are people who justify him. And it seems like they're too, I'm sure there's a lot of people who are indifferent, but it does seem like people who are in the know seem to take sides, because a lot of, and I don't mean to suggest there are people who are supporting his actions, but still say, okay, they understand because, and this is a $64,000 question, as they say, the word provocation is being thrown around. Now, I don't take that word lightly. I know it means something in English language, but it definitely means something else in military terms, right? So is it those people who say, well, NATO was increasing their forces, trying to get Ukraine to be part of it, EU was trying to be part of it, and kind of asking Ukraine to take a non-neutral footing towards Russia? They deem that as provocation, at least in terminology. What do you say to them?
Well, you can call it whatever you want to. I don't disagree with some of these people that think we didn't handle the change from the Cold War to a post-Cold War environment and the change that took place with the fall of the Soviet Union, that we handled that poorly. I agree completely with that. I agree that we miscalculated in Washington, particularly in the Clinton administration and early Bush administration. I think we made mistakes with not recognizing the fact that it wasn't necessarily that we won the Cold War, although we did have a superior system, in my view, without question. It is also that the Russians realized under Gorbachev that they needed to change if they were to be competitive in the world of the future. And so much of the credit must go also to the strength of leadership that was taking place in Russia at that particular time. Any of that and how we treated them as having lost the Cold War. I was in Washington oftentimes when coming back from Germany to talk with very senior people in the Department of Defense, and I was appalled at the way we were treating Russia. Just get in line. You've lost the Cold War. And I kept articulating the fact that these people are dynamic people. They're a great country. They're a large country. They're an important country. In the future, they will be back again, and they need to be on our side. That fell on more or less deaf ears in the excitement about supposedly having won the Cold War and defeated the Soviet Union, which in fact, one could argue we did. But in fact, that's not what you do when you're trying to build an ally. You don't turn around and stick their face in the mud. And so that was very poor politics. That and all the other things, withdrawing from the ABM treaty was a mistake at a particular time. I happened to be at the Munich conference in 2002 after we decided earlier before that we were going to withdraw from the ABM treaty. The Russians were irate. They were very concerned about it. Those may have been mistakes, but none of that justifies what's going on in Ukraine today. None of it justifies that.
Of course. Dr. Kennedy, you mentioned, obviously, I believe there was a NATO cooperation council also made to kind of bring Russia into some confidence that NATO was no longer seeing Russia as a threat. Am I reading that incorrectly, or what was the purpose of that?
Yeah, we did have, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We've had a number of cooperative agreements with the Russians. They had rooms at the NATO headquarters. They were integrated into it in many respects, except they were not members.
Which makes sense, right?
They became hostile in those environments and to my understanding withdrew. But early in this, I don't remember, it might have been around 1999, the then deputy for Russian forces and I took off and went and visited Russian forces together for about a week in Bosnia. And we were working very closely with them, providing them, helicopter support for their injured. And so there was good close cooperation early in this, but it began to turn sour, particularly, I would argue, with about the time that, you could argue that there were concerns being raised when we bombed Belgrade. That was a big turning point for feelings of the Russian people about the United States. And that probably could be argued was a terrible mistake on our part. On the other hand, it was very hard to get Milosevic to do anything in Yugoslavia, particularly with regard to Kosovo, where thousands upon thousands of Albanians were being killed. And so probably in '99, we began to see a turn in that. And of course, by the time Putin assumes a power in Russia, we are really desperately trying to rebuild relations with Russia under the early Clinton administration.
And Dr. Kennedy, just to, for those who don't know, when you mentioned Belgrade, our bombing Belgrade, basically, it was President Clinton who had decided that he had to intervene because there was a genocide of Muslims going on. Albanians were a majority Muslims, and he wanted to interfere because he thought that UN would not go along because Russia would veto it. Am I reading that correctly? Was that the idea?
Absolutely correct.
And not only that, I remember internally he got it from both sides because President Clinton was internationally obviously doing something without the UN, but at home they were saying, "Oh, it's whack the dog," because he's trying to avoid the Lewinsky affair. I believe that was going on at that point, or that hearings or something like that, if I recall correctly. So, but Dr. Kennedy, here's my question then. First of all, does Russia still have access to, or whatever that limitation of those access are, into NATO? Meaning, do we still have communication channels open, right?
We have communications channels over. To my understanding, they've withdrawn from their offices there.
Okay, that's gonna make a lot of people worry because obviously even if people are indifferent to what's going on or are too busy to read up on it, everybody is worried about a hot war, as they say, or nuclear weapons. I mean, do you see that as a possibility?
No, I do not. Let me tell you why. Putin is not stupid. He's not reckless. He's smart. He's cunning. He's shrewd. He wants to go down in history, in my view, as the person who reunited all the outlying losses that the Soviet Union's experienced at the end of the Cold War. He wants to go down in history as a great unifier. He doesn't want to go down as the person who initiated a nuclear war on the continent of Europe, and which ultimately devastated his own country. And so I do not believe that he's a very clever bargainer. I used to run a crisis management program at the NATO Defense College years ago. He's played his cards exactly as the way I would have if I were in his position. He's made everything that might appear in the minutest way escalatory as the reason he would initiate a nuclear conflict on the continent of Europe. That is not Mr. Putin.
A lot of people will be relieved to hear you say that because, frankly, that is, I think, foremost on a lot of people's mind. When they hear that we're not going to do a no-fly zone, obviously, one of the quickest explanation for that is, hey, they have nukes and they have more nukes than us. I mean, that if you're going to just evaluate on that basis, a lot of people think that. Did you ever have? I was going to ask you, did you ever meet Mr. Putin?
Never.
Okay.
I must concede to those who know him better than I do that my view may well be wrong, but that is the view I hold with regard to the prospects of nuclear war. I think he's using it as a very wonderful chip to keep the West from doing anything. We should, if Zelensky can use the MiGs, we should give him the MiGs. I think we should create a humanitarian free zone and a protected humanitarian free zone in Western Ukraine. And if the Russians violate that, I think that they should suffer the military consequences of that.
Then how would that be? And again, I did read that article. Your article was in, I believe, the Atlanta Constitution, I believe.
It was in the Global Atlanta.
Global Atlanta, sorry. And you argued for a humanitarian zone, obviously, to protect the people who are fleeing Ukraine, because as we know, they were making corridors back into Russia. I mean, it was devious what was going on. But anyhow, but how would that be different from? One would ask, why would that be any different from a no-fly zone? Let's say they violate. Do we engage then? And will that lead to, as people say, World War III?
It's not going to lead to World War III. It will lead to, well, let me first go back and say there is a difference between having a humanitarian free zone in the western part of Ukraine and defending the entire skies against a no-fly zone by the Russians. Don't forget, their aircraft can stand off way off in Russia somewhere and fire weapons into the Donbas. They don't have to be over. Matter of fact, many of the missiles that are landing are not being fired from inside Ukraine. But so you're really talking about a much more limited area, and it is there for a humanitarian reason. It is not there to defeat the Russians. It is there to protect these human beings who have been suffering the result of an unprovoked attack, unwarranted attack by Mr. Putin. I wouldn't even say the Russian military. I think he's caught the Russian military by surprise. I'm not even sure. I'm sure Mr. Shoigu, his Minister of Defense, must have been involved in that decision, and perhaps Gerasimov too, Valery Gerasimov. chief of the general staff, but it's hard for me to believe that from what we're hearing, that any of the soldiers and perhaps many of his generals really understood what he had in mind. Maybe he didn't even have it in mind until the very end. He wanted to use it as a bargaining chip when he thought that finally that the West would not respond except by sanctions, which he thought he could easily defeat because they'd never stay united. He decided to move. And he thought, obviously, what we can say is he thought it would be quick. We all thought it would be quick.
Yeah.
We all thought that his military was not the same military that they had in the early days of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That Mr. Shoigu, who had been very effective in organizing and reorganizing the emergency command, EMERCOM, when he was Minister of the Emergency Situations, would reorganize the military to be effective as it might have been during the Soviet days. He did not. Nobody anticipated that.
There was word, Dr. Kennedy, that his defense minister was missing for a week or so, and then just resurfaced yesterday in some kind of a footage where he's giving a speech. Did you hear about that?
I did, and my understanding is that there's no certainty when that speech was made. So I didn't listen to it. I don't, I don't speak Russian. I have a few words that I use when I travel there, but so I don't know the exact content of this.
There was a display of power that Putin made just before the invasion, where he lined up all his people and they came one by one at the podium and basically saying what they thought about it. I believe that's what he was asking. And then he would dress down anybody who kind of showed any sort of hesitation. So he got them in line one way or another, I assume, as most dictators do. Would that be your assumption too, Dr. Kennedy?
I think he's got them in line. I don't expect that anybody's going to remove him, as many of the people feel might be the case.
Yeah, and that's why I think asking for regime change and some sort of a miraculous revolution from within might be a little bit utopian, or just like, it might be just a pie in the sky kind of dream. But because he's been so brutal internally, if that was going to happen, it would have happened probably by now.
Well,
maybe.
The State Department backtracked on his statement with regard to regime change. And so I think it was a misstatement. I'm sure it was not in his written speech. It was an ad lib near the end there. And so I think, again, he misspoke on this particular thing. Okay. You don't call for regime change and at the same time trying to change the behavior of the leader.
Right. Okay, Dr. Kennedy, now, just switching a little bit, expanding the view of all the hot zones in the world where war is going on, where conflict is going on. Some people, especially, a lot of minorities in the US, I think they see this as, and I want to ask your view on this. Basically, they say the same thing. They say, okay, well, when, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, or what's happening in Yemen, where we're helping the Saudis kind of, do the reverse of what's happening in Russia, where we're trying to put a pro-Saudi person back in, or they're trying to, and we're kind of giving them some sort of support or a green light at the very least, and looking the other way. So they basically call out the hypocrisy of things. Is it hypocrisy, or is it realpolitik? I understand every country, including our country, the US, has to, work on its own national interest. But do you think it becomes a bit too much sometimes? And do you think people who are criticizing that are right in saying that it seems like when, the theater operation is Europe, war is seen as a different thing than when it is in Syria or Yemen or Iraq or, anywhere like that? Or do you think it's the fact that Russia is involved at this level that has made the difference?
I think, first of all, it's a little bit of a mischaracterization to kind of equate the ones that you've equated. First of all, the problem with the Israelis and the Palestinians is a problem on both parties. I mean, there have been terrible atrocities on the Israelis perpetrated by Palestinians. The Israelis has responded in kind. It's very hard to, from my view, it's hard to take a clear side on that. My feeling is that those people need to solve their problem together, and it doesn't seem to be a very easily a problem that can be very easily solved. we have already, with regard to the Houthis and the Saudis, we've already put the Saudis on warning that we are very concerned about the way they've been conducting that conflict. And we reduced our assistance to the Saudis with regard to the conflict. That does not mean that we find the Houthis to be the type of people that should be running that country. And certainly their allegiance with Iran does not help things with regard to what's going on. But the United States does not sanction the kind of brutality that goes on anywhere. We don't sanction that. We don't sanction it in Ukraine. We don't sanction it when it takes place between the Palestinians and the Israelis. We don't sanction it when the Saudis may be doing that against the Houthis. We just don't sanction brutality around the globe.
So basically, every theater of operation is different, and we're, in your estimation, we have taken some steps to kind of try to help everywhere we can. Is that what I'm hearing? Basically, you're saying that conflation of these conflicts is a mistake.
Have we made mistakes in judgment periodically? Absolutely, we've made mistakes. One thing about the United States that's great is when we make mistakes, we try to correct them, and we often admit them. That has no moral equivalence to what's going on today in Ukraine. It has nothing to do with whether they're black, brown, or yellow people. We felt like we made a tremendous mistake in Africa. You know, in Rwanda, President Clinton thought that was the worst decision he ever made, to stay out of that. And that was between, you know, people in the African continent.
Right.
So it's not an issue of whether it's against, you know, we've supported people, whether they're Islamic, whether they're black, whether against brutality.
Dr. Kennedy, I guess my last question would be, if you could kindly let's talk about the fact that you know, NATO obviously has a lot more partners now than obviously after the Iron Curtain was lifted. Do you think? And I read some of this in your article. What is the resolution? What are the potentials? Because obviously Ukraine is being devastated, and as valiant and courageous as they are, this is a war. This is brutal. People are dying. People are running away. What is the solution? Do you think it's still possible? Actually, let me just ask you this. Do you think President Biden at some point would have to take the measure to sit down with Putin and kind of give him that face saving after things are worked out? Do you think Donbas would have to be given back, or how do you think this will be resolved?
It has gotten to be even more complex than it was at the very beginning. Zelensky will probably not survive the presidency if he gives away territory. It will not be easy for him politically to give up Crimea, because they still claim, and as they should, that Crimea is their territory. It will not be easy for him to give up Donbas, much less just the territories that were originally occupied by Russian-favored forces in the Donbas near Luhansk and Donetsk. So that's a very difficult problem. Putin, on the other hand, can't go away with loss. And so trying to get those two people together is going to be very difficult. It's compounded by the fact that we've already made these statements about regime change, and we've used ugly terms, however true they might be. In a political sense, one leader doesn't call another leader by the names.
It's undiplomatic, right, Dr. Kennedy? Undiplomatic terms, yeah.
The one good thing that we have going for us in the possible solution to this is the fact that the Ukrainian people have been determined, and they are putting up an extraordinary resistance. The West is still, Europe and many other countries around the globe are standing firm against Russia. And this definitely works in the long-term favor. Whether Ukraine can hold out that long, it's hard to say. That's why I think we have to up the ante. I think we have to first start with a humanitarian free zone. I think we should give Putin throw him something he can take back to his people. Maybe it's a statement that in the foreseeable future, we don't see that Ukraine would ever become a member of NATO. that, having said that, that probably holds as much water as the Budapest Accord in 1994, where Russia, the United States, and Ukraine and the United Kingdom guaranteed the borders and sovereignty of Ukraine. But at any rate, he could take that back to his people and say, well, see, it was worth it. Now they're not going to become NATO members of NATO, and perhaps he would at least withdraw to where he was before the invasion took place.
But that begs the question, Dr. Kennedy, that what we see now happening in reality is Sweden and Finland, I mean, two neutral countries taking an active role in help. And again, it's a matter of perspective, I suppose, but those countries after the Second World War became neutral and stayed neutral. And so now we are basically looking at Germany actively trying to add more to its military budget. I mean, while Europe, the continent, is taking a U-turn, how can Ukraine go, okay, well, we're not going to be part of this just to stop the war? Does that seem feasible? Or I guess what I'm asking is, how do Sweden and Finland engage at this point and Ukraine decides not to? How will that look?
Well, first of all, Sweden and Finland, to my understanding, the last comment they made is that they're not planning to join NATO. They are planning to assist, and Finns have a long history of, fighting the Russians. They fought them to a standstill at the beginning of World War II, and so that doesn't surprise me that they're willing to jump in here and help out as best they can to a country that's under siege by Russian forces. I don't see how. I think it is entirely possible, for example, for President Zelensky to say, as far as I can see into the future, we do not plan to become members of NATO. And that doesn't mean he won't work closely with the West. That doesn't mean he won't become members of the European Union. If that's what it gets to give Putin a chance to pull his troops out, that might be worthwhile.
Okay, Dr. Kennedy, last question for real this time. I know I've kept you long enough. Once again, thank you, but I have to ask you this. And, Germany, and you've worked in Europe closely with, I'm sure, all the partners there with NATO. Germany getting back into the game where it increases its military budget, it gets back into, I don't know what the word would be, on a war footing, or at least more prepared. With the rise of the right wing everywhere, Europe and the US, do you think that's something we should be worried about? Because, I mean, obviously, what we saw happen in the Second World War, even though it seems like long ago now, but it happened pretty rapidly, how the whole society was changed. And again, I'm not saying that can happen again. I'm just saying, should we at least keep something we should worry about, allowing people like countries like Japan and Germany to have more military at this point?
That's an excellent question. And I think the other side of the coin is equally interesting. And that is that with this invasion, it may in fact hurt right-wing parties and right-wing affiliates throughout Europe. That Japan may eventually feel like it needs to rearm, perhaps even acquire nuclear weapons, I think that's going to be sometime in the future. I know they've talked a little bit about that under the previous prime minister. I just don't see that happening. Germany, I welcome the fact that they're stepping up to the plate in terms of their weight and stature, in terms of potential military capability. I am not at all worried about the fact that their right wing might come to power. It is interesting to me to see how most Germans and Europeans have responded to this what's going on in Ukraine. It's also interesting to see what's going on in Poland, where we've had governments, and Hungary, where we've had governments that have been perhaps less than ideal in terms of the democratic structures we like to see in Europe. So I don't think the right wing is going to be strengthened by what's going on.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Well, Dr. Kennedy, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to have you back on other issues. I know the Iranian deal is still being renegotiated as we speak, and hopefully we'll have some topic on that. So thank you so much for your time. And once again, I can't be more honored to have you on my show. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Been a pleasure seeing you again, Cheyenne. Very best of luck to you.
Thank you.